Okay, so what I'm doing on the side, folks, is just putting the outline of the talk on the side, because quite often I like to talk to people face to face on this. So I will use some screenshots, but I'll just have them up there briefly. So if people want to follow the lecture in terms of the bullet points, they just go to the chat box, if that's okay, Chair. Right?
I think it's fine. Let's wait for a while.
That's fine. I've still got to close down a couple things and make sure I've got the right pictures and the right documents in the right place. So absolutely no rush. And I think this is the last point coming up. Right. So we navigate.
Rahman, do you think we should wait for a while? I know that there are many people are here, and I can see Kembut is also here, Bezan Hoca. As well.
Dr. Ali Onur, I think it's totally up to you because it is the first session of this morning, so people might be late a little bit, but it's totally up to you to decide. Thank you.
It's not fair for those people who live in different time zones, especially in England. It's 8 a.m. It's 10 a.m. in Turkey.
Is there a link to the session that can be put on social media? Because I was going to put it on my Twitter and Facebook pages.
Yes, I will find it for you.
Yeah. So if you just
it's in progress, don't worry.
Yeah, but it's just that, yeah, it's in progress. But yeah, but it just means that I can put the link and get more people in as well. So some of my colleagues in the UK who have just found out about the conference, I can put the link up. I'm just going to turn off this light behind me because it's throwing a bit
I
of a
share it
strange...
on chat box, the link.
Yeah, put it in there. Yeah. And then I'll copy that onto Facebook and Twitter. And we say, let's see what we got. How's everybody doing this morning? Okay. We don't know yet.
I think everyone's okay.
Yeah, we still don't know. Okay. All right. So give it maybe just a fefew seconds while I pop that up. Here we go. Ali Onur can tell you that I'm addicted to my social media way too much. So let's just pop that up there. Let's see if that worked. Yeah, that worked beautifully. Well, excellent, most excellent. And let's just put that up on Twitter as well. Okay. And hopefully no trolls like the one we had yesterday. Okay.
All right, I think we can start now. I also shared it on my Twitter. Let's see if some other people will follow. And thanks for attending this conference. This is 8th IEPAS conference on Eurasian politics. Today, Scott Lucas is going to present his talk. And before going through his talk, I'd like to introduce him briefly. Scott Lucas is an academic, journalist, and political analyst. He has got his emeritus professorship from the University of Birmingham. Lucas is currently associated with Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. He is the founder, editor of EA Worldview, and the co-founder with the Clinton Institute of American Unfiltered. And he works regularly with outlets such as the BBC, Al Jazeera English, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and TRT World. He also presents the World Unfiltered program for Deep Dive Politics channel. Lucas is a specialist in United States and British foreign policy. His research interests also cover current international affairs, especially North Africa, the Middle East, and Iran, and new media and intelligence services. He's recently doing a podcast program called as Kremlin File to analyze Russian domestic and foreign policy. So he is really versatile, both in terms of academic and journalism. So please feel free to ask as much as question as possible. Scott, floor is actually the virtual floor is yours. You can keep it a bit short. Maybe we can just have more time for a Q&A discussion.
Yes, I mean, we're here till 9 o'clock, is that right? So, you know, we'll probably try to speak for about half an hour at most, but I really want to get ideas from the audience. Hey, folks, thank you so much. It's really a real great excitement that I get to be here today and to join you, especially after hearing some excellent presentations yesterday. But I must also admit it's with a bit of sadness that I join you, because Lisbon, for my wife and I, it's my favorite city in the world, right? And so we wish we could be there face to face and enjoying it in all its glory. But this is also great to meet you virtually. So we'll go with that today. I'm a strong believer that you should know a person where they come from when you hear them talk. So thanks to Aliona for that excellent introduction. But just to sort of be full and frank with you, I have worked for a long time as an academic, but maybe about just before the Iraq War in 2003, I wanted to go back to journalism, because I wanted to be able to publish on a day-to-day basis about international relations. I had started as a journalist, a different kind of journalist, a sports journalist, a long time ago in America, and I went back to it. And so when Aliona kindly refers to this website, EA Worldview, and I put the link in the chat box, it's very much a site where working with people in Syria, in Iran, the Middle East, people in Turkey, as well as in the UK, Europe, and the United States, it's a day-to-day site to try to understand what is going on. Aliona also kindly mentioned our project that we're working on together, Deep Dive Politics and World Unfiltered. And if he'd like, he can put the link to that up in the box while I'm chatting. And also a couple of other projects, America Unfiltered with the Clinton Institute, which focuses on the US and the world, and then Kremlin File with Monique Kamara and Olga Lautman, two of my colleagues, which is now focusing on Russia. And if I get a moment, I'll put the links up. But the reason why I tell that to you is the biggest change for me is that having trained as a specialist in US and UK and US foreign policy, the effect of this study of the world in its different regions, to me, was the importance. It was shifting from looking at the world through a US first lens or a UK first lens and trying to just understand it as a student from the ground up. So if I'm going to write about Syria, which I'll refer to in this talk, you've got to be in contact with Syrians. What are their hopes? What are their aspirations? What are their fears? Where do they see their country, or what is left of their country? What place does it have in the world at this point, if any, after 10 years of conflict? And the same is true for Iran. You have to work from the ground up, or from Turkey. You have to work from the ground up with respect and with tolerance when you listen to people, and not just say, no, 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 this is what is really happening. And that's been a big influence on my approach to international relations. And so what I wanted to do today was to put out some thoughts to you. And just because I'm not always sure that I can share a screen properly, and I have put the outline to the talk in the chat box, so you can follow along there. I also don't like to have the screen up much. I like to see you and chat with you face to face. So while I will jump, while I'll introduce each point with a quick share screen, you can follow along throughout. Hopefully I won't lose my way. So the title is Damage and Recovery, Where Now with International Relations? And my starting point for that question, before giving you my ideas, personal ideas on where now in relations, is really three observations to start with in terms of the immediate context that we're dealing with. The first one is the notion that we are in an era where we have thrown out the rule book, very much thrown out the rule book on how we analyze international relations. I'm sure you all recognize that fine fellow there. I'm a big believer in using photographs to make a point. And in many ways, Donald Trump was an illustration of how the disorder of the individual could corrupt, pervert, throw into disorder the supposed international order that we have. And of course, there's been an awful lot written about Donald Trump. I can remember telling a conference a few years ago that whether I had been trained in the bureaucratic model as a political scientist, I had been trained in the rational actor model as a political scientist, and I just said that I shredded every single note from those models at that point, watching how Trump behaved. But it's not just the point that Donald Trump created disorder. There are other actors as well. And I would say, for example, who are not necessarily irrational, who could be quite rational, but they created disorder in their ways as well. And I'd give you as an example, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. That the disorder of the individual actor, whether you're a realist, whether you're a constructivist, whether you're institutionalist, a structuralist, we were in a different position, or at least a magnified position regarding disorder because of this. The second, actually, let me get back properly. The second point that I want to make is the disorder of the system. Now, the disorder of the system is a disorder which came about not because individuals were irrational or necessarily chaotic, but because, and you'll hear the shorthand, liberal international order. I'm not a big fan of the term, but if you want to use that shorthand, that there were a number of developments in recent years, whether it was the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, whether it was the reactions by various systems and regimes to the popular protest in North Africa and the Middle East since 2011, whether it was the ongoing issue of Afghanistan, whether it was an aggressive Russian foreign policy that was very much disrupting the idea that you had a set of rules and norms that we were operating on since 1945. So I wasn't sure if the way I had been trained in international relations gave me a handle toolbook to understand what was working on a day-to-day basis. That was magnified. Well, this is something, and I must now be honest with you, this is a section that I added to the talk yesterday after an incident, or after a discussion, let's put it that way, in this conference. And that is, and if you beg me, I will tell you this since that happened. A very good panel yesterday covering a range of areas, covering Abkhazia, covering China, covering the question of humanitarian intervention. And I asked the question to a number of the panelists, to all the panelists, in fact. I said, well, how does propaganda and disinformation affect your perspective on these issues? Or how do you navigate propaganda and disinformation? And one of the participants, who I won't name out of professional courtesy, came back to me and said, propaganda, let me tell you, Professor Lucas, about the white helmets in Syria. That the white helmets in Syria are they're a front for the Muslim Brotherhood, that they stage all their rescues in Syria, that they are effectively a fake group. And I protested. Well, in fact, I actually said that this participant's point had actually proved or answered my question in a different way. It actually showed the pervasive nature, the poison of disinformation, even upon us as analysts of international relations, to which this participant said, no, go think about it. Go look it up. Go look it up. And with respect, I have looked it up because I've covered Syria on a day-to-day basis since the uprising began in March 2011. And I've covered the White Helmets since they were formed in 2013. And they're not a fake group. They're not a front for the Muslim Brotherhood. They're not a front for Al-Qaeda. That is a sustained propaganda campaign, which includes Russian outlets, which includes Assad regime outlets, which includes a number of Western activists, a British blogger named Vanessa Beeley, a Canadian blogger named Ava Bartlett. And this social media network, this social media environment has put poison into anyone trying to understand the Syria conflict, and beyond that, trying to understand how even in the midst of conflict, you can get a voluntary group which tries to save lives rather than take them away. So how do we in the 21st century cope with that information, disinformation? Sorry, I held that on the screen for just a bit, but it was a story I wanted to tell you, to try to illustrate what I hope is a significant point. So familiar, but farther and faster. There will be those of you out there who will come back and quite rightly say, well, this has happened before. There are individuals who have been quite chaotic and disrupted the international system. There have been various systems that have challenged the international order. There has been propaganda, certainly, for hundreds of years. What's new about that, Scott? What's new about talking about that? And what I would come back to you and respond is that, yes, we're in a familiar world with all of that, but it is farther and it is faster in terms of what happens. And that is because of the nature of the combination of politics and media and technology. You have a quicker spread of the event. You and I can know almost instantaneously what is happening in a place like Nagorno-Karabakh. We can know what is happening with the Russian elections. We are in this world, this networked village, as some people have tried to call it, of the internet. But at the same time, precisely because information moves and disinformation moves farther and faster, and politics moves farther and faster, at least personally, I feel overwhelmed. How can I begin to navigate this when I'm getting hit from all sides on a range of issues in which I'm interested? So it's the speed and it's the scope that means, just to give you an extremely good French sociologist named Jacques Ellul, E-L-L-U-L, wrote in Propaganda in 1964. It's not that we are not smart enough. It's not that we are not, educated. That's not the problem with propaganda. The problem is that although we are educated, we have so much coming in to try to deal with that we still have to try to evaluate this according to our preconceptions, according to our socialization. And that challenge has been accentuated in the 21st century. So picking up on that then, to bring up the next slide, to build on something that, well, two different people have raised this in different ways in recent days. Joe Biden said earlier this week at the United Nations that we're at an inflection point in global history. Ken Booth said in his excellent presentation, well, no, it's not really an inflection point. That at least the pandemic is not. That it is broad, but it is not deep. I would have to say that I tend to lean towards the former, that we are at an inflection point in world history. It's certainly not the only inflection point that we've had. There have been inflection points. I think World War II might pop up. World War I before that. I think the combination of 9/11 and the Iraq War 2003 is another inflection point. I think the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, is an inflection point. So there are a series of inflection points because what happens is it changes the kaleidoscope of international relations. And by kaleidoscope, I don't know if you all are familiar with this, but when I was a kid, you have a little tube and you turn the tube and little pieces rearrange. They make different patterns. And these inflection points create different patterns. There's no set center that is there. There's no set center there where you say, and always the pleasure of the white noise in the background. No doubt the Russians are listening to us, but that's because I tend to keep an eye over my shoulder for them. So before anyone else drops in, let me continue to say that this kaleidoscope means that rather than having the center where you can say, well, it's London, it's Moscow, it's Beijing, it's Ankara, it's Islamabad, you have to look at a changing pattern of relationships between countries, between communities, and between individuals in the context of catalytic events, and the pandemic is one of them. And of course, one of the significances of the pandemic, well, actually, let me continue on to take this into a next section. So that's my context section. And what I'd like to talk to you now about, if I can make it, is to talk to you about navigating this. If I have, in effect, at least personally for myself, destabilized working as someone in international relations because of having to deal with so much information in the 21st century world, because of dealing with both rational actors and irrational actors, because the models don't necessarily fit anymore, where do I begin? I begin with, this is my fifth point, I begin with the notion of the global and the local. Not a new point. Many people have worked with it. There was even a process in the 1990s where you had scholars who were talking about globalization, but then there was a response to it that says, well, now we need to talk about globalization, how the global developments or global catalyst, economic, political, social, work out at the local level. And I agree with that. I agree with that, but I would sort of modify it for what we're working with. The image, by the way, is of one of the leading Tigrayan activists at a rally in Washington, D.C. We just interviewed her for EA Worldview, talking about that conflict in Ethiopia, but about that conflict in Ethiopia from the ground up, especially its effect on women and girls. What I'm looking here is for a recognition of the transnational and international issues alongside a recognition of local effects and local dynamics. And what does that mean? What does that phrase mean that I come up with, which is local effects and local dynamics? Well, let me actually, before going into detail about navigating the local, working from the ground up, make an intervening point. And the intervening point is that the challenge for us is the obstacle of the national in between the local and the global. Let me preface this by referring a little bit to some grand theories that have been created to try to explain the global, but explain how the national, or at least the conception of the national, tended to get in the way of them. One of the ground theories that I grew up with was Marxism. Don't tell my mother that. She'll be very, very upset in my home state of Alabama. But of course, I have a great respect, even admiration, for the analytic approach of Marx as a sociologist, Marx and Engels, I should say, sociologist, economist, working in the field of ideas, working in the field of political philosophy. I've continued to pursue that, for example, with an admiration, for example, for the work of Antonio Gramsci. The problem with Marx and Engels is that in supposedly explaining the global to us, they went to an endpoint, a determinist endpoint of the national. And the determinist endpoint of the national was, for example, that a developed society would end up eventually in a communist state. This would this would happen eventually. And of course, those of you will know that their initial examples were France and the UK. Didn't happen that way. Russia actually was not one they thought would reach this endpoint of communism very quickly. But it's not just Marx and Engels. You could talk about, for example, Paul Kennedy in the 1980s. Again, someone I tremendously respect his work. But this idea of the rise and decline of great powers, which simply became determinist in the idea that whether it was the Netherlands in the 16th, 17th century, whether it was Spain, whether it would be the United States in the 20th century, that eventually these powers would fall. Now, while it is true that there has been a great deal of disorder in imperial powers, in nation powers, it's not a determined process. By focusing on the nation or the empire to the exclusion or setting aside the global and local dynamic, you run into this problem. And this goes all the way to our time through Francis Fukuyama. Spoiler alert, history did not end in the 1990s. It goes all the way through to those who talk today about the idea of, well, there must be an American decline and there must be China rising. That has to be the way that it is going to play out. That, of course, does not deny that China, for example, is becoming economically, politically more influential. It doesn't deny that the United States relatively, in terms of relative power, political, military, economic, is not as powerful as after 1945. But to treat this as a national determinism, and to do this while pushing aside the global and local dynamic, that to me is a bit of a problem. Let me explain a bit further. This notion of the global and local with the obstacle of the national is that leaders will tend to be national first in their construction and execution. They will, as we have seen at the UN General Assembly this week, will present their national interest cloaked in an approach to transnational issues. Thus, you have the specter of Joe Biden. And I fully agree that climate change is the critical issue of our times alongside the pandemic, but saying, all right, we will contribute to the climate change initiative through putting in more money, but as part of what he has set out in recent weeks as an America First approach to international affairs, alongside the America First approach, for example, to Afghanistan. You will see, for example, and I will cite this because I was kept waiting for 20 minutes yesterday by, I was appearing on a Turkish outlet, and it gave 20 minutes to President Erdogan's speech. And it was, let's say it praised President Erdogan's speech very much over coronavirus and over climate change and over the need for cooperation, while setting aside in that 20-minute introduction that President Erdogan was actually pursuing a very national first agenda as he presented those transnational issues. That it was a national first agenda when he talked about Syria or when he referred back to refugees. You would expect that from President Erdogan. You would expect that for a number of reasons I can discuss in Q&A if you wish to. But we have to acknowledge that you have this national first perspective, and it's not just leaders who are national first in construction or execution. Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Boris Johnson, if he actually had any idea of what he was doing. Analysts are often locked into national first perspectives as well. And that national first perspective in my generation, growing up and in my training, has been interacted with the trap of American exceptionalism. It just so happens that because a lot of the economic power was in the United States after 1945, that a lot of the ways that we try to define international relations were set out by American scholars. English became the prevalent language for academic scholarship as it crossed borders. English, of course, became the prevalent language for much of communications, including the internet. English became the prevalent language for political analysis. And thus it was US actors, and to an extent UK and European behind it, that defined our field for us, which is fair enough. But the problem is that we had the trap of American exceptionalism. That on the one hand, analysts and advocates and politicians, on the one hand, would talk about a unipolar or an exceptional US good, a unipolar conception that reached its height in the 1990s from political analysts like Charles Krauthammer to, I like Bill Clinton. I think he's a good guy, but read his millennial speech at the turn of the 21st century, that a unipolar US good. And then on the other hand, those people who criticized US policy were exceptionalist as well. It became an anti-imperial US bad. So we're in the position today, at least I'm in the position, that when I discuss Syria, I'm caught between those who talk about a valiant US policy, or one that was valiant in the past, and we are trapped by those who criticize US policy and completely erase Syrians when they talk about what happened in Syria since 2011. I'm trapped in that when I talk about Iran. I'm trapped in that when I talk about Libya. I'm trapped in that when I talk about China. It is not US good versus bad as the starting point, but with much of social media, as well as sometimes in our field, because there are academics who are part of this, this locks it in. And therefore it distorts and disrupts our consideration of the post-1945 international. Consider the phrase liberal international order. Liberal international order, I'm a big believer in an international order. I'm a big believer in the norms and rules of international order. But that idea is associated with primarily US-based academics and analysts who quite often use liberal international order as a rationalization for American power, or at least for an American primacy. And I say that with respect. As part of our project World Unfiltered, Alejandro, you might remember when we interviewed John Eikenberry, a fantastic academic, absolutely nice guy, but that was a big pivot of my discussion with him, is in presenting liberal international order, are you not continuing to defend American primacy? On the other hand, a critic of liberal international order like John Mearsheimer, who has gone after Eikenberry pretty savagely in recent weeks, recent months, does so in the guise of that he thinks America is wrong on China. Bottom line, that's what's happening here. And so liberal international order becomes a play term for where American power is in the 21st century. That's not the way to begin when we talk about international order, in my opinion. Nor is it the case that we go with an exclusive bipolar. The bipolar was a term I never liked in analyzing the Cold War. I never liked analyzing it because it was never just the US and the Soviet Union or the US and Soviet systems. Where was China? Where was Europe as the European bloc developed? Where were the countries of the Middle East? Where was Turkey in this supposed bipolar? And I certainly don't believe in it in 2021, when again, for example, I have heard presentations recently, very recently, that have been almost exclusively on a bipolar, which is US versus China, to the point where the European Union, which I think does have a significant economic and political influence, isn't even mentioned, is erased, even though its economy is actually, I believe, larger if you take the European Union as a bloc than that of the United States. The bipolar assumes national competition and confrontation in many cases, and it erases almost all communities in doing so. So what do we do? I'm thinking about another 5 minutes, Alejandro, if it's okay. What I'm going to propose.
It's fine. Yes, it's fine.
Okay, I'm going to propose to you, and I'll go back to screenshot because I've rambled on a bit. I'm going to propose to you the notion of working from the ground up. And when I talk about working from the ground up, let's share the screen, that what what we are facing is the effect of abstract, and again, I'm a big follower of world systems theory, so I'm not criticizing Wallerstein, I'm not criticizing the way that it's been deployed by many good scholars, but if you just treat it in the abstract without going to what is happening on the ground, that the effect of abstract world systems, national first bipolar approaches is to erase the local, and that has been magnified by disinformation. Disinformation, which quite often is trying to actually not even mention those who are affected on the ground by developments. So my proposal is a simple one, is that we recover that as a starting point. Let me explain, if I can, by going back to the screen, and that when I talk about going back to a starting point, for example, if you are going to write about China, and I'm a great believer, I'm not a Chinese specialist, but I believe if you're going to write about China, you have to become a student and you have to write about China in many different ways. And just to give you an example, in terms of illustrating both the strength and the challenge of China, about 20 years ago, you might remember the SARS incident. Not SARS incident, it was the SARS epidemic. And I was working with a Chinese PhD student who talked to me about the development of technology and said why it was so significant. And in effect, the way that many Chinese individuals found out about SARS was through mobile phones. That news of SARS spread so quickly that it forced the authorities to finally make an admission that there was an issue. But the point that was explained to the scholars is that China, in a sense, almost skipped a generation in communications technology by going beyond the landline to mobile phones. And I had never thought of it in that way, that jump in technology. And of course, just the fundamental point that China is an extremely large country, an extremely diverse country with the largest population in the world, and that the challenge of a China rising today is still within China, that you've got to provide something. You've got to hold this country together. You've got to hold all these people together in this great national ambition on an international stage, and that there will be local issues as that happens. So if you ever consider Xinjiang province, to understand what is happening in Xinjiang province, socially, politically, economically, and in terms of religion, for example. And I could apply that same idea of working from the ground up. Well, again, if I could tell you a story very quickly, EA Worldview started in 2008 as a website, a news and analysis site on US foreign policy. Within months, we had changed. And we changed because people came to me and said, well, our first test case using social media, using Twitter, was to cover Israel and Gaza. And to think that we could gather information from our correspondence as quickly as any major outlet during the December 2008 conflict, the Israeli attack. And I can tell you in Q&A how we actually scooped the BBC. I'm bragging a bit, I know that, but I'm making the point. We wanted to know what was happening in Gaza on the ground. It happened in 2009 with Iran, with the protest against the disputed presidential election. And then it happened across the Middle East and North Africa with Syria, Libya, Yemen, Iraq, even Algeria. Now, because of where we are today, we only really cover Syria on a day-to-day basis. We don't have the resources. If anybody wants to come help us, we'd love to do it. But it was the idea of you have to go from the ground up in considering this. So working with that ground up approach, what I then would complement that with is the idea that, and again, it's a very simple one, that we need to rethink rules and norms. I don't propose, given all my difficulties with applying grand theory that I've explained, that we abandon the notion of rules and norms. To the contrary, I think we rethink institutions, and we've had some excellent papers, for example, about the UN, but I think other institutions as well. I would be talking about health institutions like the WHO, the World Health Organization, economic institutions like the International Monetary Fund, institutions for education, institutions for social development, rethinking institutions, what their role is, how we support them in an era when those institutions are challenged both from above by national leaders who are trying to undermine them, who are trying to block them, and also challenged from below by those who are trying to discredit them by spreading disinformation. I would argue that we need to rethink the humanitarian and the right to protect. One of the critical questions for me right now as someone in international relations is, where is the concept of humanitarian intervention? A generation after it was proposed in the late 1990s for political reasons, for example, by Tony Blair in his Chicago speech in 1999. But where are we with the right to protect, which I think is a valuable principle? Where are we when the right to protect has been eroded and almost destroyed because of the political manipulation and invocation of sovereignty? C, I don't propose that we get to a resolution by doing this, but I propose that we do get to a recognition, at least a recognition from the ground up of the movements that continue to take place, not to be pro-America, anti-America, pro-China, anti-China, pro-Russia, anti-Russia, but a recognition of people who are seeking political, social, and economic space, and most importantly, are seeking security. They just don't want to be bombed. They just don't want to be detained. They just don't want to be displaced. Working from that up, because that is a common transnational, that everybody wants a safe home for themselves, for their kids. They want jobs, they want educations, then build up to your theories, then build up to application. So in conclusion, and with my gratitude for your patience as I've tried to hold this together, the race never ends. And you'll hear the cliche, but I'm a big believer in the cliche. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. History never ends. History is a kaleidoscope itself. It reconfigures, it takes different shapes, it takes different images, but then it reconfigures again. The folly of determinism. No single actor wins in that kaleidoscope. The Americans did not win after 1945. I can point you to a series of problems within America, within the country where I grew up, and problems in America today, which actually are part and parcel of the supposed American rise of power since 1945. The Soviet Union did not win in the kaleidoscope. That's quite obvious. China doesn't win in that kaleidoscope for reasons I can explain about if you define it as confrontation and competition. Indeed, and of course, communities and individuals do not win the way that determinism sets this up. There is no victorious proletariat. There is no victorious unipolar power or unipolar community. And we all lose with determinism, with the elision of the transnational. Climate change, pandemic, education issues, questions of income inequality. So I propose we navigate the global with respect to the local of the individual and build up from that basis. That, or those, are my thoughts. Again, I thank each of you so much for the chance to talk to you today, and I really welcome your thoughts now in the time that we have remaining.
Scott, thank you so much for your insightful presentation. Actually, it's enlightened me a lot. I'm sure that this is kind of like a structure of your book, right? You are writing up a book, as far as I know.
I'm writing a book, but it is having basically told you don't be national first. I have chosen to focus how America got itself into the Trump era and how it can get itself out of it. Hopefully that book will be put in a wider context for some of the points.
There are a lot of things that I'm sure that all the participants will follow up, because this is a really nice presentation, although there is kind of like a speculative in a sense. I will start first, then maybe I will leave the floor for the participants. Maybe they will have some kind of like a questions. I'm sure that there must be some questions for you. Two things actually. You never mentioned about ideology and identity when you are having this kind of like a framework. How does this ideology and identity play worse? Because why I said this ideology, because there are some kind of like academics who tend to analyze the recent situations, or maybe they compare this with the Cold War, and they said this is the new Cold War era. If it's a new Cold War era, and if you believe in so, how the ideology plays. And secondly, you didn't mention about Afghanistan, how this recent withdrawal from Afghanistan plays role in United States foreign policy. These are two questions from
Oh, good.
my side.
Two really easy questions, right? It's like, so that's so simple. All right, first, when it comes to identity as my opener, I would say I'm a big believer in working with identity and indeed with ideology. It was actually the grounding of a book I wrote about the US approach to the Soviet Union in the Cold War called Freedom's War. But what I would say is, at the same time, my difference from other scholars is identity is not fixed. Identity is constructed. And my problem, for example, with the Clash of Civilizations approach of Huntington is that he fixed identities. I would even argue he made up identities with his idea of West versus East. There is certainly an American political culture or a British political culture or a Chinese political culture that in some ways is nationally bounded. But that identity does change and it does shift, and it is not completely nationally sealed off. What I would also say is that identity quite often, and this is our challenge as scholars, is that we lose the ability to interpret identity because identity gets used, or people deploy identity as a political weapon. Trump, who's not a very intelligent man, but who is very cunning and so on, he tapped into what he considered to be an American identity, make America great again, and he exploited that. The Brexiteers in the UK tapped into not a UK identity, by the way, an English identity, and there's a huge difference. And they tapped into an English identity to say that England must divorce itself from Europe. In recent days, Emmanuel Macron, who justifiably is angry over the Australia-UK-US trade submarine agreement, is still tapping into his conception of a French national identity in the way that he deploys this. So identity is part of our evaluation of the local and of, then we work up to the national or the regional, but we do it from the ground up. If you work with identity from the top down, you fix it, you pin it, and you trap yourself. Once again, in terms of Afghanistan, there's really two levels here. And there was a fantastic panel on Afghanistan yesterday, which I thank all the participants for it. And what I would say with Afghanistan is that as an analyst, I can give you an approach. And quite often when I have to do TV and radio appearances, I'm brought on because I'm the American guy. And so it's like, tell us about the Biden administration. And if you want, I can tell you more about how I think the withdrawal, the US withdrawal was going to happen from Afghanistan, but the manner of the American withdrawal, and I think many of us agree on this, was disastrous. And it was disastrous for ways we can explain, but I don't want to just stay there. When I go to Afghanistan, I want to go to the local in terms of what happened. So when I say that the American withdrawal was disastrous, I want to say first and foremost, the American withdrawal was disastrous for many people in Afghanistan. Education, society, health, economics, basic security. I don't want to start with American withdrawal from Afghanistan and what it means vis-a-vis China, although it's part of the reason why the Americans came out, to redeploy resources. And if I want to talk about the effect on the Afghan people, I need to learn from scholars, as I did yesterday, about Afghan institutions, or what remains of Afghan institutions, of Afghan actors, and not just the Taliban. I need to know about Ismail Khan and Iran backing of Ismail Khan in the West. I need to know if there's still any influence for groups like General Dastum's group. I need to know also that Afghanistan is not just one single Afghanistan people who are oppressed by the Taliban, but that there are people who support the Taliban and why they support the Taliban. So that's just a general opener in terms of Afghanistan, where, and again, it just so happens that I don't actually specialize in Afghanistan. I got to be honest here, but quite often, if I'm asked to give a 3 or 4 minute interview about Afghanistan with a TV or radio outlet, I've got to go to that starting point of going inside Afghanistan rather than just using Afghanistan as some type of pawn or some type of token for a discussion.
Thank you so much, Scott. I think we have one question from Faik Hassan. Faik, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So I would like to mention a few points which Professor Scott has mentioned. I think the religious identity is also working somewhere. Second, in Afghanistan, the religious-based motivation was a factor when both were fighting, Afghan Taliban and the US forces. My third point, as you mentioned, you want to know about the Afghan institutions. So I think a spirit is required by the West. When we saw the fall of USSR, the West collaborated and played its role in stabilizing the country, in stabilizing the assets, in stabilizing the military. So that same spirit is also required towards Afghanistan by the West. So I would like your comment on that, sir.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm gonna do this in two areas. First of all, religious identity, absolutely fundamental and part of what we have to bring in to our interpretation. But again, let me just tell you a little story about the dangers of this. In 2003, when the Hawks, the American activists who wanted to attack Iraq, they wanted to convince George W. Bush this was the right thing. They brought in some Iraqi expatriate scholars. And the Iraqi expatriate scholars who were in favor of the invasion started to explain about Shia and Sunni Muslim. And Bush was blank. Oh, sorry, Shia and Sunni Islam. Bush didn't know that there were different, didn't know there were Shia and Sunni. That was the level that the US was at in 2003 before going into Iraq, that there was no basic conception of religious identity for much of what they were doing. But at the same time, and I think I want to amplify this in the point of, though, however, I always want to work with the notion that within countries and between countries, that identity is not fixed. Is, for example, then when you talk about what is happening inside Iran, which happens to be an area that we cover day to day, you know, this is, I think, possibly the primary, possibly the only religious revolution of the 20th century in a large country. There are a coalition of groups, but it pans out that it is a religious bloc, effectively, a Shia religious bloc that takes control. Yet, if you're in Iran more than 40 years later, that religious identity is contested. It's not opposed. It's not like that there are groups within Iran who are saying, you know, we don't want to be Shia and we don't want to be Sunni, because Iran has a significant Sunni minority, but it is the interpretation of Shia by our leadership is corrupted. And much of what you saw in 2009 with those protests against the presidential election, as they continued, was about the perceived corruption of that religious identity within the system of rule. It wasn't actually representing us. In Afghanistan, there is a debate going on, or certain scholars who came out, and it's just a tagline. It can only be a starting point for what we talk about. But that is the idea that the Taliban are not, let me get this right, they're not a strict interpretation of Islam. They're a radical interpretation of Islam. That their interpretation of Islam has to be considered as something which is actually trying to change, fundamentally change, religious identity as it is deployed through politics and society. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think it's an interesting starting point to discuss, especially going forward. Your second question on Afghanistan, and this came out in the panel yesterday, absolutely, is it is the interaction between the internal and the external, the absolute interaction between the internal and the external. So if you take the period after the Soviet Union left, as you go through the 1990s, you have the various factions, such as Mr. Hekmatyar, such as the groups like Mr. Massoud and eventually become the Northern Alliance, such as the groups that become the Taliban, but they interact with not only the United States, not only the so-called West, they interact with Pakistan, they interact with Iran, they interact with the former Soviet republics like Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. And that in itself is a type of kaleidoscope where the patterns are being changed by multiple actors. But it is not the case that the internal actors are controlled by the external actors. At the same time, the internal actors are not entirely autonomous. They do rely on external support, or at least they try to maneuver for external support.
Okay, I think Faik Kassan is satisfied with the answers. We have a few questions on the chat box. Do you mind asking these questions by yourself, or do you want to prefer that I will ask these questions? Because I have questions with Professor Andre Lungs and Professor.
Okay, I will. Do you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, well, you've covered a whole range of global issues, in particular, unipolarity, bipolarity, and the so-called world's liberal order since the Second World War, because that was underpinned by Americans' dominance, perhaps until now. America is still dominant, overpowering in a number of fields, but it's no longer able to call the shots all the time on all fronts. So what kind of a world order do you imagine would happen from now on? Or do you dispute the very idea of a world order? I mean, there's got to be some kind of a norm, some kind of what's going on. And my question is posits the distinction from what has been running relatively smoothly, perhaps for the a couple of decades since the Second World War, until now, when there is two powers and a number of other revisionist powers, if you like, seem to crash with one another, and then posing threats to a lot of norms and so on, to what's been happening before. So if you accept this kind of, that's the reality, what's going to change? Well, what kind of a world order we'll be looking at? You concentrate, you refer to individuals, you refer to what's the other one? Non-government organizations, perhaps. But influential as they may be in some sectors, after all, they don't dictate geopolitics all the time. They may affect some aspect of international relations, but they are not sort of that powerful compared with governments or state institutions. So bearing in mind the role of individual and also non-government organizations play, but still you have big governments concentrating the power in terms of economics, in terms of the military, in terms of geopolitics, diplomacy. So what kind of a world order we'll be looking at, say, from now on? I mean, what kind of changes we can expect?
Wow, that's a great question. And it builds nicely, by the way, on your excellent presentation that I saw yesterday. Ali Oner, before I answer the question, who was the gentleman that we interviewed about global society, the Turkish businessman, economist?
Which one?
About global society for World Unfiltered.
Bahadır Kalas.
Global society is the George Soros, is it?
No, it was a Turkish individual, and Ali Oner, you may want to put up the name of that individual in the link to the interview, because this was, sorry, I've diverted a bit. We actually tackled this in an interview, a fascinating interview we had about global society. I largely agree with what you're talking about, because I don't ever think there has been, as an endpoint, as a determinist endpoint, there hasn't been a world order in the sense that in the Cold War, and this is my problem with some of the liberal internationalists, not with the idea, but the execution, is that you will know, and all of you will know out there, that the United States was involved in a great deal of disorder in terms of its interventions in governments during the Cold War. You'll know that the Soviet Union was involved in a great deal of disorder as well. And so that, you know, we've never been at a point where I'd say we're going to reach a world order with a set range of institutions that's going to lead us, as it were, to the endpoint that's existing. And we're still there in 2021. But again, I would build up from what I see as a basic analyst. And that is, despite all the degradation, despite all the continued destruction that takes place, both within countries and beyond countries, there are institutions that remain, that exist. What's the Hippocratic oath? First do no harm, and then try to do good. So the United Nations, which comes in and is bashed quite rightly on a number of levels in terms of what happens, but there are a number of UN bodies that do excellent work on a day-to-day basis. Educational initiatives. The very fact that the UN, say, through the World Health Organization, alongside the World Health Organization, for all the flaws of the approach that was taken in this pandemic, at least we have had that institution that has developed through the pandemic to try to give us some type of approach, as flawed as it is. That we have had the attempt at peacekeeping in various parts of the world, which has not succeeded in many areas. It certainly has not succeeded in parts of Africa, for example, but it has in other places mitigated conflict. That the very example of Syria, where on the one hand, you have the United Nations through some of its institutions enabling the Assad regime, the way that aid is distributed, but on the other hand, through the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, at least has called out and said, chemical weapons have been used in Syria. There needs to be accountability. At the end of the day, I think the tension is this. What I'm advocating for you is perhaps a utopian approach, but more which considers institutions with a focus that links the local with the transnational, which is why climate change and the pandemic are so important. But the problem that we have is that even the very notion of order has been defined and has been debated in the context of national interest and of national nations who form blocks. And we continue to trap ourselves in that. Now, I don't think that national leaders will say, you know what, Professor Lucas makes a very good point. We need to start looking transnationally, and we need to stop defining, say, US versus China, or China versus US, or Pakistan versus India, or India versus Pakistan, or you name your countries that see each other as enemies or as foes. But I do think that as analysts, we don't have to follow the patterns. We don't have to go into the traps that are set by that. That's why I continue to kick back in terms of the US versus China to say, look at the other actors who are there. And let me just give you one example. As flawed as it is, I will be very interested to see what the European Union, which has national interest within it, but what the European Union does with the so-called global gateway. You know, I suspect this didn't make headlines in many places. It didn't in the United States because the US doesn't look at the EU. But the global gateway talks about development, investment, trade, health, education, as well as a European military bloc. But it is being proposed in a way, whether or not it comes about, which is not to be part of a confrontation. Now, you will come back and argue quite rightly that the EU Global Gateway is alongside China's Belt and Road Initiative, and I would agree with that. I don't know where it's going, but what I could say to you is there are certain points within the international community where this problem you raised has been recognized, and the idea of going back to a US liberal international order is not an option. The idea of a China-led order is not an option. So where do you go next? I can't give you any answers, but I can give you points of looking which do include NGOs, which include individuals, but at some points do involve entities which at national level begin to recognize, and let's see what happens in Glasgow in November. You know, folks, if we don't deal with a transnational issue as a matter of urgency, all of us go down, none of us win.
Thank you so much. We only have 10 minutes, and for the last questions, sorry, Rahman, I'd like to give this chance to Bezen Hoca. Professor Bezen Coşkun, do you wish to ask your questions by yourself, or shall I?
Yeah, I will. Okay, thank you, Professor Lucas. It was a very enlightened presentation, and it was covered many things in just half an hour. My question is, from very start of the pandemic, I'm thinking about the combination of climate change and pandemic actually provided an opportunity for international community to rethink about change. But instead of an inclination towards transnationalism, we are observing a more trend towards a more nationalism and the rise of ultra-right movements. So even the European Union, which is based on a transnational mindset, so has seen a trend towards nationalism and right wings. Do you think this is a result of the failure of transnational or international organization of the system, or it's a result of the ongoing crisis of globalization? Thank you.
Let me answer that in two parts. And then I need to treat you to a coffee at some point to talk to you for hours about this, because this question of the, and I'll keep it to the pandemic for now. I won't talk about climate change, although we can in a follow-up. This reaction to the pandemic has been fascinating at local level, national level, international level, but within the context of the 21st century social media environment. Let me just say, first of all, that the reality in some communities is, well, here in the United Kingdom, where I'm located, we have almost 90% of people over 16 who have had their first vaccination, and we've had more than 80% who have had both doses. In the European Union, which lagged behind the UK at the start, it is now, or some countries in the European Union have now surpassed the UK, such as Spain. In the United States, where there is a serious problem I'll talk about, but at least you have, I believe, around about more than 70% of adults who are fully vaccinated. The problem is that in the social media sphere, have you ever heard the expression, the squeaky wheel gets the grease? That the anti-vaccination activist, that the disinformation specialist have shouted loudest. And I want to tell you one story, if we have just a minute, to tell you why this is part of a wider disinformation effort. Some of the loudest anti-vaccination voices on social media that include the British blogger Vanessa Beeley, that include the activist Cory Morningstar, that include the former UK academic Piers Robinson, were not known in recent years for being anti-vaccination. They were Syrian war crime deniers. They were part of the Russian-backed disinformation sphere that said it's terrible, the West is trying to overthrow Assad. They moved from Syria war crime denial to anti-vaccination. Some of the right-wing groups in the United States were not anti-vaccination to start off with. That includes right-wing militia. They moved to anti-vaccination. What links the movement? Because they use the specter of globalization as their punching bag. So who is behind the vaccination effort to control our brains with microchips? It is George Soros, and it is Bill Gates. You will see the phrase, the Great Reset. The Great Reset is part of the approach to the pandemic. It's part of this issue that we just talked about with Professor Long about a global society, which is how to reset relations. It came from the World Economic Forum in Davos. But of course, that means it must be a globalist conspiracy. On the one hand, you have seen examples of cooperation at community level, at national level, and at beyond, not just with vaccinations, but with containment measures. And don't just think about New Zealand. Everybody likes to say, oh, New Zealand is an exception. Think about Iceland, isolated, I know. Think about Taiwan, for example, but think about the Scandinavian countries, not Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland, that contain this relatively effectively. How did they do that? Scientists learn from each other. Sometimes policymakers learn from scientists. So while the far right quite often gets noise in this moment, what we have actually seen in the pandemic, in which we have to recognize that more than 4.5 million people have died, is that we have been able to act to limit the damage in one way, but not in another way. What happens also with this disinformation effort is it distracts us from what is the key issue right now, which is the distribution of vaccines in all communities, in all countries. And that is a question where you have the problem of national first in terms of distribution. And then you have the problem of ideological and political positioning, where, for example, Iran would not distribute that. Iran's vaccination rate was only 3.2% fully vaccinated in August of 2021. It is now 16%. What made the difference? Because the government changed. The Supreme Leader's office did not support the outgoing government, wanted to blame it for problems, would not allow the import of vaccines in great numbers until after the new government came in. A simple, narrow national interest that has led to a very, very high death toll in Iran. And again, we can tell stories like that within countries and beyond them, but fundamentally, Joe Biden, from a national first interest, goes up and says 500 million more coronavirus doses around the world. Let's see it. Let's see other countries do it, because I'm going to tell you something else. I don't mind someone operating national first if it's for the transnational good, but that's what I want to see happen.
Thank you so much, Bezan Hocam. And also, we have actually 3 minutes. If you want to keep it short, Rahman, I'd like to give the last chance to you. If you keep it short, and of course, Scott, if you keep the answer short.
Yeah, I know that's a problem for me. Yeah, okay.
That's another problem for me too. I think it's better if you don't start at all, because we have just 3 minutes for the next panel.
No. I'll treat it like a TV interview where they say you got 60 seconds. That's it. You know,
okay.
Question.
Okay, with the disinformation, the table you have just showed us, I think includes a contradiction, because otherwise we are now occupied with our ideas or the worldviews, and it is getting stronger. And actually, we don't start from the ground up, because we want to believe what is the close to our ideas.
Yeah.
And our ideologies, and so we don't trust the opposite or the other alternative resources coming from the social media. We are just following ours or our colleagues who think in the same way. So we don't, as you said, actually we are trapping ourselves. So how we crack this system up and just get the enlightened, or how we say, try to get the correct news, right news, rather than the disinformation.
Yeah, that's the personal issue that I wrestle with. It's one reason why I went back to journalism, to try to do this on a day-to-day basis. Point one, Jacques Ellul, E-L-L-U-L, has said exactly what you said, that we set up parameters, limits on what we see because of our particular church, because of the school we went to, because of our family, because of our professional group. And Ellul's book is, you can't really get out of that. That's the way it is. My point two is very different. It's from a TV series called Dragnet. Not a very good series, but I grew up with it as a kid in the United States in the 1960s, where Detective Joe Friday would always say, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. To go to the ground, to go to sources which are reliable, to establish why they're reliable, and to educate myself, to build up from the ground. You know, it's not the case that I made the assumption in Syria that Assad was evil. And, you know, in other words, I'm not a regime change advocate. I'm not a neoconservative. What happened in Syria is I wanted to learn what was happening in the ground. In 2011, I wanted to know about the economy, politics, the system, and I learned about it. And then I watched those protests being crushed to the extent of bombing an entire city, Homs, in early 2012. And that's how I made my judgment. I have been to Iran. I have taught in Iran. I have met wonderful people in Iran. I can no longer go to Iran since 2009. I'll tell you that later. In 2009, as someone who had said that Iran had been subject to a great deal of American pressure, had been subject to a great deal of what I thought was a misguided US foreign policy. I saw what happened with that presidential election. I studied further what happened with that election. I talked to people from all sides of the Iranian spectrum, the economy, economic, society, religion, etc. That was probably a fraudulent presidential election. It was certainly not transparent. Those protests were genuine protests in Iran. They were not manufactured by the West. They were not instigated by the West. So you at least have to say that what happens in Iran has a local basis that you build up and suspend what you think. In other words, your main source is not the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington, which just believes you should bomb Iran, nor is it Ayatollah Khamenei's office in his official statements. You have to find other sources and educate yourself without going to the presumptions that have been set at a higher level when you address an issue. Same thing for Israel-Palestine, by the way, but that's for another panel. We'll talk about that later.
Thank you so much, Scott. I think we should finish it here. And thanks for all the participants and their comments and questions. It was really nice conference from the morning. And I will turn to Rahman. I think, Rahman, the second panel is starting, right?
Yes, thank you for everyone, for Professor Lucas, Professor Alon Roselig, and all the audiences who patient enough to listen to all the discussions. And I hope that is helpful for all of us. And it is already 2 minutes late for the next panel. The program is not be closed, so we can just switch to next panel. Thank you very much. And the next panel can start.